Peter, I have to go to you first because you called Kavanaugh a spectacular pick. Why?
Well, because I think that he has intellectual and moral integrity. He's extremely smart, very well qualified. His opinions are outstanding. I'll give Donald Trump credit. He picked someone who was the antithesis of himself. He's a person that is, as I said, intellectually and morally outstanding. I knew Brett in the White House. He was staff secretary. Before that, he worked in the legal counsel's office. He's meticulous. He's calm. He's temperamentally conservative. He's reliable. Everybody who worked with Brett had a very, very high opinion of him. So I really do think he's a spectacular pick. I am a fierce critic of Donald Trump, but I'm capable of saying when he does something right, and I think in this case he did something right.
Brett, I want to ask you about Politico's reporting that Justice Kennedy favored Kavanaugh. Not a "I'll leave if you give him the seat," but does it surprise you that that could have influenced President Trump, who truly likes to go his own path?
Look, Kavanaugh was a clerk for Kennedy, and it must have pleased Kennedy to know that Kavanaugh would have been a likely successor. And by the way, Kavanaugh is, I suspect, will, if he's confirmed, look like a justice in the mold of Kennedy, which is he's not going to be a doctrinaire conservative. He's capable of thinking for himself. He was not the most. He's not always the most conservative judge on every single panel. And some of his rulings, some of his thinking, but the one that keeps coming up, which is his belief the president should be immune from certain investigations and civil suits. That was written in 2009 when President Obama was president. That may be a style of thinking that will serve a Democratic president far into the future once Donald Trump is in the past. So I agree with what Pete Wehner just said. I think he's a terrific pick, and I think he's not the hill that the Democratic Party wants to die on.
I want to stay on that point because you know Democrats are going to push it. I have a quote from it in 2009 when he wrote, "We should not burden a sitting president with civil suits, criminal investigations, or criminal prosecutions. The president's job is difficult enough as it is, and the country loses when the president's focus is distracted by the burdens of civil litigation or criminal investigation and possible prosecution." Democrats have already made it clear that this is going to be an issue in Kavanaugh's hearing. I want to share what Cory Booker said.
He picked the one guy who has specifically written that a president, in fact, should not be the subject of a criminal investigation, which the president is right now. So this seems to be, of all the people, the most self-serving person he could choose in order to protect himself from this criminal investigation.
Jennifer, I'd love for you to weigh in here. To say this about a civil suit is one thing, but that the president shouldn't be subjected to a criminal investigation if he broke the law, does this not make Kavanaugh pretty vulnerable?
Right. So I think one of the interesting things about that article is he's talking about this as a matter of policy. So he's basically saying Congress should pass a law that exempts the president. But what that means by implication is that there's no constitutional bar. And right now there's no law that prohibits the president from being prosecuted. So there is a way to read this as potentially leaving open the possibility, although he's clearly urging Congress to do something that would protect the president. I don't think anybody should be surprised that we have a president who is nominating a very conservative justice. This is why elections really matter. And there is a lot that hangs in the balance here. Obviously, Roe v. Wade, the future of the Affordable Care Act, and the ability for the requirement that insurers continue to insure those with pre-existing conditions, privacy rights in the digital age, environmental regulations, the ability of Congress and states to impose reasonable regulations on the use of guns. All of these things hang in the balance. And I think we have a conservative president who nominated a conservative justice, and I don't think anybody should be surprised about that.
All right, Matt, let's look at the big picture, because here's what Kavanaugh wrote about his judicial philosophy. A judge must interpret statutes as written, and a judge must interpret the Constitution as written, informed by history and tradition and precedent. Is that good enough for conservatives?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you don't see a lot of conservatives getting mad this morning, right? John McCain came out pretty quickly and said this is a pretty great pick. There's not a lot of the lukewarm is from one senator right now, is Rand Paul. And I don't think it really has anything to do with George W. Bush. I think it has to do with Kavanaugh's sense of the Fourth Amendment and the collection of metadata. He ruled basically on the opposite side of where the Carpenter Court was, saying that the government doesn't have access to your third-party data out there. But no, conservatives are very happy. But what I would add, and this is an important one, he came up in an early Obamacare challenge, and he talked about the philosophy of deference. And he said that the courts should avoid the temptation to get into big, weighty constitutional issues on big, weighty laws. Like, have a sense of restraint going into a place.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, this is in a 2011 case here, whose name escapes me. He was in the dissent and said we should not get into this case because we should basically hang back and let the legislative process on such a big thing which affects so many people's lives, the judicial branch shouldn't be getting involved in that right away. We should wait back and defer to the legislative and political process. This speaks to temperament. This is a much more John Roberts approach than it is a Scalia approach. It is saying that we shouldn't jump into something. We should defer to the majorities. That I think could have some implications on all kinds of things, including his potential approaches to Roe versus Wade.
Well, that's exactly it. And in his 2006 confirmation for the D.C. Circuit Court, he said explicitly Roe is the law of the land, and it was reaffirmed in the Casey case, Casey versus Planned Parenthood in 1992. I mean, conservative judges believe in originalism, but they also believe in what Scalia once called faint-hearted originalism, which means a great deal of deference to stare decisis, to judicial precedents. So I don't think, I think it is unreasonable to think that Kavanaugh will be the deciding vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. There might be decisions at the margins of abortion law, but this conservative judges in his tradition understand that courts should not be in the business of social engineering.
And Peter, are we going to learn more about Kavanaugh in the confirmation hearings, you know, his views on specific issues, or is it far too political to get specific and he's just trying to get through this process?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, you are going to learn something about him, both in terms of the analysis that goes on, but you're going to see him testify, and he's going to be grilled, and you're going to see how he handles himself and what his temperament is and how quick he is on his feet and all of that. But he's going to follow the playbook that really every justice has since Bork, which is he's not going to go too far or go into specific cases. I think that's a reasonable position to have. Democrats won't be happy about it, but in the end, it won't really matter because the Republicans have the votes. I don't imagine that any Republicans are going to break away, and I'm guessing that several of the red state Democrats are going to vote for him. This is a stormy political time, but I think that Brett Kavanaugh is going to sail through, and I think by the end of this process, people will be more encouraged by what they see even than they are now. You can't go through a Supreme Court confirmation hearing and not reveal some of who you are.
Jennifer, the Federalist Society is organized. They've got a list at the ready for the president, whether it's for this pick or lower courts. Does the left have a similar organization?
So the left is organized. The left does have equivalent vetting procedures in place, but it's true. The Federalist Society is incredibly effective. They're incredibly well-heeled, and they've done a really good job of presenting President Trump with a lot of very conservative justices that will change the future of the judiciary and of rulings for a very, very long time. It's why elections matter so much. This was huge on the agenda in the presidential election last time around, and it should be on people's minds when they go to the polls in November for the midterms and the future of the Senate right now as well.
Then who's the equivalent on the left?
So there's the American Constitution Society, which does a lot of work in terms of looking at the kind of liberal approaches. There's other organizations as well that do vetting of judges that send names up as well.
Brett, you said this is not the hill that Democrats want to die on. You don't want to fight this. So what do?
they win on elections, on issues where Democrats can make a difference and where they're going to be popular. Look, I think Kavanaugh should be confirmed 100-0, just as I think someone like Elena Kagan should be confirmed 100-0. The point is, if you have a well-qualified judge who's in the broad mainstream of the American movement, doesn't have any moral disqualifiers, you should go back to the tradition we had as recently as Sandra Day O'Connor. She was confirmed 99-0. But look, Democrats are going to lose on this issue, and it's going to make them seem extreme and petty. There are a lot of issues. There's a lot. Immigration is one of them. Foreign policy is another. Economic policy is a third. A lot of issues where Democrats can win elections, but they're not going to win it on this one. They're just going to remind conservatives and independent voters that maybe the Democrats are too far to the left for their taste, and it's actually going to help Donald Trump in the election. If they make a federal case, or if they try to die on this hill, it's going to help Republicans in the midterm.
If this is such a strong pick, what does this do for President Trump's legacy?
This is the thing that Republicans who hold their nose about Trump, this is the Butt Gorsuch, analysis of Trump. So they got him the tax cuts, they got him the Supreme Court picks, and they got some deregulation. And I would point out that this also backs up the deregulatory effort, as does Gorsuch. Those two justices potentially have some of the strongest kind of anti-deference to regulatory agencies out there. So they're going to be very skeptical of EPA going out there and making their own law. But they're also going to be skeptical, and we've already seen this with Gorsuch, of immigration enforcement claims by the federal government. You might find that on this side, holding the fort against Donald Trump is Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.